Do you think Congress thinks long-term when it comes to the key issues facing our nation, such as the economy, education, and the war in Iraq?
I think I actually have to give probably a little bit different answer for each one of those. A lot of times, Congress does very long-term planning, and I think tax policy, and that's part of the answer for your question about the economy. Tax policy, I think, is very long-term planning. I think on a lot of military things, like what does it take to defend the country if a nation might be attacked, I think there's long-term policy on defense of a country. But now, if you're in war, like you mentioned Iraq, or this would be true of any war, actually, you can't do long-range planning in the war because you don't know what the enemy's going to do. You don't know what you confront in the war. I think when you say, do we do long-term planning, the longer-term planning you can do, the better off we are as a matter of public policy. But there's some things that you can't always plan long-term.
Do you think Congress does enough?
No, I don't think so. I sometimes say this way, which is answering your question that we don't do enough long-term planning. Too often, Congress is concerned about the next election instead of the next generation. And that's sad that we're concerned about the next election. And all of us have a responsibility to be concerned more about the next generation than the next election, but I'm just saying what the reality of it is.
Should the legislative process be streamlined or made faster to reflect the technology that we have today?
I think it's fine how it is. I think that if you rush through things too quickly, it never turns out good. So I think it should just stay how it is.
I think that it needs to be sped up. We do put a lot of thought into it, and I think that at sometimes, in the cases of emergencies and stuff like that, the thought process takes too long, and by the time that a decision is made, the critical moments to help that emergency have already passed.
I think the circumstances should be considered for how fast a bill should go through, depending on what happened, but we shouldn't lose all the checks and balances of our current system by reforming it.
Does Congress reform itself sufficiently to keep up with changing needs?
Well, the Constitution is the document that really tells us what we do. This little book is really our mandate for what the rule of law is, and we can reform ourselves, but within what the Constitution says. And it is what we have always called a changing document because it's so perfectly written that it gives us a wide latitude. But the Constitution starts with Article 1, which is really, it starts with the Congress. It doesn't start with the executive branch. It starts with the legislative branch. So we consider that that's very important. But this is what gives us, what our duties are, what our responsibilities are, and what we're supposed to do, and then the rest is left to the state.
So we know that Article 1 of the Constitution enumerates or lists the power of the legislative branch of government. And an interesting fact is that the legislature listed in Article 1, it's actually much lengthier than the other two articles which list the powers of the judicial and the executive branch. So in now knowing that the listed powers are much longer than the other articles which talk about the executive and the judicial branch, what assumption can we make about what the founding fathers thought about the role of the legislative branch of government?
Should be bigger than the other branches.
Okay, and by bigger, what do you mean?
Like more powerful, have more rights.
Okay.
Represent what the people think because they're voted by the people, for the people.
Senator Risch, what would you say are some of the most important responsibilities of a member of Congress, and what are some of the more difficult responsibilities?
Well, I think probably the most important responsibility is being responsive to the people who sent you here. The U.S. Senate, as you know, is the only place where Idaho stands head-to-head with every other state in America. We have 2 votes in the U.S. Senate, and Idaho's 2 votes counts the same as New York's 2 votes and California's 2 votes. So it's important that we represent Idaho people when dealing with other states.
And the most difficult responsibilities?
Well, I think probably keeping up with everything that has to be done. There's only 24 hours in a day, and it's very difficult to stretch it beyond 24 hours. So that's probably the most difficult thing. My days are taken up with committee hearings and voting on the floor and meeting with constituents like this, and it's hard to cram everything in.
What does the public misunderstand about the legislative process?
What does the public misunderstand about the legislative process? Well, I think probably the public doesn't understand the degree of detail and work we go to before we produce a product. I think a lot of people think we just vote based on what we think, but most of the things that we do on the floor of the Senate have years of preparation to them. I mean, just look at the global warming issue and carbon and climate change. I've been on the committee 4 years in the Senate. We've been holding hearings for 4 years. We're just now getting to the point to see what carbon reduction standards we can put in. And it's very controversial because carbon sequestration is still a science that's not totally developed yet. So I don't think, and I don't say this as a criticism, if there's a criticism, it's on us to not do a good job educating people. But I don't think there's an understanding or an appreciation for how complex some of these things are and how deeply we go into them before we act. There's an old saying about the United States Senate. When the Founding Fathers put the Senate together, the House was the people's house. But the Senate was to legislation what the saucer is to a cup of coffee. You know, if coffee's hot, you kind of put a little bit and slosh it around the saucer to cool it off. The Senate is the body that kind of cools off something that might be getting started rapidly without as much forethought into it. So that's kind of the role that we play in the Senate, and I don't think that's as understood as really it should be, and that's our fault for not getting that out.
You guys familiar with the term partisanship?
Yeah.
Do you feel like there's adequate room for both parties to work together? Or do you feel like one party is naturally going to dominate this process and the other party isn't going to get its ideas or its views through?
It all depends on who's in control, who's got the majority rule of it.
Okay.
On a lot of issues, there's just simply no compromise. Like abortion, you're either pro-choice and pro-life, and there's not a whole lot of gray in between. So you can seriously see where some issues get really partisan.
Okay. So you're saying there's certain issues where partisanship plays a really heavy role, and certain issues compromise is more, or bipartisanship is better, happens more? Okay. Yeah. All right.
Hi, I'm Samantha Justice, and I'm from Portland, Oregon. And my question to you is, do you believe Congress is working hard enough at bipartisanship?
Clearly, this has been a major concern for this Congress, and I probably put more emphasis on bipartisanship and trying to find common ground than any other thing that I do. For example, and you'll see it on my website, I have the first bipartisan universal coverage health bill in decades and decades. 6 Democratic senators and 6 Republican senators are co-sponsoring the legislation. If you're going to get anything important done in Washington, D.C., it's got to be bipartisan.
How do you build consensus with members of Congress that have such varied backgrounds and come from such different parts of the country and represent so many different constituencies? Can you describe that process?
Building consensus is simply a matter of bringing people together and finding common ground, finding what issues unite us. A good example is the Amtrak reauthorization. For 12 years, the Republican majority in the House and the Bush administration refused to fund Amtrak and refused to pass an authorization bill. In 2 successive budgets, President Bush proposed bankruptcy for Amtrak, putting it out of business, selling the pieces off. That's our national passenger rail system, a remnant of the days of the freight rail era, when freight rails also carried passengers and the and intercity mail. And we struggled to just keep Amtrak afloat. So in the 110th Congress, when the Democrats had the majority, I consulted with the ranking Republican member on our committee, Mr. Mica, John Mica of Florida, who had been a supporter of Amtrak, but in a different way. He had some very different ideas than mine, than those of us in the majority in the Congress, the Democratic majority. But I said our goal is to have intercity passenger rail, whether it's Amtrak or someone else, that's a different matter. But our goal is to have intercity and preferably high-speed passenger rail. So let's talk. Let's find ways to accomplish that incorporate your ideas and mine. And we did. We came up with an 11-corridor proposal with options for private sector financing, bidding by Amtrak, by state rail systems, by commuter rail projects, by private sector interests to submit their proposals to the Department of Transportation, have the department evaluate those, and then make recommendations. With that understanding, with that agreement, we got an Amtrak bill passed through the House by 350-some votes.
What are some points that you've identified where compromise and accommodation for other views could happen?
We picked 4 debates because it's where you discuss the bill and your opinions and everything, and you might not have considered somebody else's opinion, so it could influence the way you talk or the way the bill is made and stuff.
Okay. What's one thing you guys had? What's a point of?
We said committee hearings are heard because that's also where citizens express their opinions.
Okay.
So everyone's heard there.
So it's okay.
Does the legislative process reflect a proper level of accommodation and compromise?
A proper level of accommodation and compromise? Occasionally it does. Very often it's a matter of sort of a standoff, because if one Republicans say up, the Democrats say down, and vice versa. And so unless you're able to find a way to bridge the gap, there's not much accommodation. Then it's just a matter of who has more votes. But from time to time, things are so important that you can get both sides to give a little bit and come up with something that will get 85 votes or 86 votes or something like that.
What is the value of debate? Do you believe debate is a legitimate form of give and take based on facts, or is it just showboating?
Debate is a very important part of our function here, because it gives me the opportunity to better understand the viewpoint of somebody maybe from Galveston, Texas, or from the Hurricane Katrina area. We don't have hurricanes, so I don't really understand what a hurricane is like and how devastating it is to a family. But then they don't necessarily have the drought situation in a rainy area that we would have. And so I have to make my best pitch of why I think there needs to be drought funding. They make their best pitch of why they think there needs to be hurricane relief funding, and the debate begins, because you have only a limited amount of money. Here's my voting card. We jokingly say that this is the only credit card in the world that's worth trillions, because it is how I vote. And we have a little slot up there, and when the bells ring, I've got 15 minutes to get from my office to the House chamber, stick this in a slot. Now that would maybe seem old-fashioned, like why wouldn't you have the opportunity or ability through telecommunications to sit in your office and vote, or stay in your home district and not live in Washington, D.C.? Debate. If you didn't have the human interaction of the committees and bringing people together to talk to you and you to listen to them, and you to argue about the president's priorities or maybe the differences between the various parties or the geographical areas, if you didn't have that human interaction of the debate itself, you wouldn't have as good a government as we've got.
When you really get down to it, a lot of times we think of lobbyists as, in these power suits and walking around the Hill and using a lot of money and power and influence to make things happen on Capitol Hill. But when it really comes down to it, a lobbyist is a person that has an opinion about a policy or a political process or a law, a potential law, a bill, and someone who tries to persuade or advocate on behalf of their own opinions. So who can be a lobbyist? Anyone, right, perfect.
How do you respond to people who say that members of Congress just listen to lobbyists rather than people like me?
You're here as a lobbyist. The word lobby is to talk to your member or your representative and express your points of view or your desires. So, in a sense, you're here as a lobbyist. The reality is there are lobbyists, and so that is a fact. But many lobbyists are hired by school districts, colleges. So not all lobbying is bad. Lobbying basically is an individual coming and talking to the representative and trying to find a solution to a problem or create an opportunity so we can make a better life.
I am just a farmer was my mantra. One day while watching TV, a bunch of guys just like myself recited a poem. I am just a farmer, pure and simple. And I thought how truly the words described who I was and what I've always wanted to be. Then along came a lawyer who asked me, "You really can't make a living off that place, can you?" I responded, "I tried." Soon after, I learned my family farm was the focus of our general plan process. Lawyers and elected officials, using the terms like sphere of influence, annexation, eminent domain, municipal services, and LAFCO, were going to determine if we would be able to continue to farm our land. My family purchased our farm in 1990, and we've persistently worked the land, even though fires, floods, droughts, unfavorable market conditions, and noxious weeds have sometimes impeded our progress. Land speculators looking to strike gold by getting farmers to cash out their lands for subdivisions, politicians wanting a higher tax base, and uninformed citizens were about to take away the lifestyle we had chosen. In preparing our defense, we found in 1998 the California legislature enacted the Farmland Security Zone Act, which contracts with farmers and landowners to keep their property in agricultural production for at least 20 years. This legislation prohibits annexation without the landowner's permission. This law, the California Farm Bureau, and many supporters throughout our county joined in protecting our farm through the legal onslaught that followed. After 14 months and a series of court appearances, we won the right to keep our land in agricultural production. Now I'm more than just a farmer. After this experience, I was elected to the Sierra County Board of Supervisors. I'm working to preserve the custom and culture of a successful 150-year agricultural economy in Sierra Valley. I believe government policies and actions are necessary to respect not only the rights of individuals wishing to farm their land, but also the rights of individuals who treasure open space and rural country living. In the 21st century, developers, land use planners, ranchers, and government officials need to learn from past mistakes, work collectively to pursue common sense legislation, and to protect the ever-dwindling agricultural lands for future generations.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines with mutually agreed swaps so that secure and recognized